Yo, what's going on, Boston Source here? And this is to kind of like put this particular topic to rest, at least for now. Over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 months, we've been talking about a potential fight between the WBC lightweight champion Devin Haney and the WBC featherweight champion Gary Russell Jr. Now it stems all the way back to, like I said, April, when a little bit of talks kind of like flamed up in reference to that particular fight. We did bring it up in reference to Haney calling out Gary Russell Jr. at that particular time. And it had been, addressed at that particular point. And then let it marinate for a little bit. A little bit, I would say a few months. And then you fast forward to, pretty much around August or, August time. And you had the stuff that was going on with Gary Russell Jr. and Terrence Crawford. And Gary Russell Jr. was on the podcast to talk about that. And then you had this thing with Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr. come up again. And they wanted to say that they were working towards making a fight. So that had been marinating for about a few weeks or so. And then around the 10th of this month, we had Gary Russell Jr. on through phone call. That was it's on one of those midweek reports. That was on September 10th, where he talked about, the negotiations between him and Devin Haney's team. And then it was followed up by, what Bill Haney was talking about. And then the next day, it was pretty much laid out that there was nothing coming from the zone to back that particular fight for November. But on Sunday, we pretty much hear from, the manager of Yuriorkis Gamboa saying that the deal is in place for Yuriorkis Gamboa to face Devin Haney. And I'm here to tell you that's basically what it was the whole time. Okay? There's things about negotiations and possible fights that kind of come up. But one thing to watch out for is that when something is publicized and put out there in the media, and put out there social media, whatever it is, between two guys that are potentially fighting, and nothing seems like it's really serious, but then there's somebody else that's a potential opponent for one of those guys, but nothing is said about it for a while, then usually that's the opponent that they're going to face. And that's basically what happened here in this case with Devin Haney. Now, like I said, we had Gary Russell Jr. on September 10th. And Gary Russell Jr. and Bill Haney were talking with each other on September 11th. Now, on that particular date, media members received an email from Matchroom Boxing talking about a possible fight for Devin Haney on November 7th with two opponents, Gary Russell Jr. and Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, given what was said between Gary Russell Jr. and Bill Haney saying, there's no money for the fight for November, that basically took out the fight right then and there. But also there's this thing too, and it was discussed on the podcast that was held live Sunday, is that if there is a fight that is basically official, you would usually have 8 weeks to prepare for that particular fight. Now, given the amount of back and forth between Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney and Bill Haney, if there was actually a fight between those two, then Gary Russell Jr. would be at the very least preparing for that particular fight and in camp for that particular fight. Usually with an 8-week camp, that's what you have, right? But he wasn't there in camp for any type of fight. But Devin Haney was in camp. Devin Haney was training. Devin Haney was sparring. So that means he already had an opponent in place, and that opponent was Yuriorkis Gamboa. So now that is what we are looking forward to on November 7th. Devin Haney, Yuriorkis Gamboa for the WBC lightweight title. Now, to me, it is what it is. Right? We know the situation with Yuriorkis Gamboa. On December 28, 2019, it's pretty much what it was, December 28, 2019, in Atlanta, he faced Gervonta Tank Davis, went through 12 rounds, got stopped in the 12th round, suffered a leg injury, Achilles injury, dealt with an Achilles through a major part of that fight. We don't really know how much he has recovered from that Achilles injury. But he is basically enough for him to be available to fight Devin Haney. Now, on the flip side, you do have Devin Haney, who last year fought in November after defeating Zohar Abdullayev. That was last September in the theater at Madison Square Garden to have the interim WBC title, right? And then he had a follow-up fight against Alfredo Santiago where he pretty much scored a shutout decision win but injured his shoulder in the process. And that's what, took him out of action for that duration up to the end of that year until, pretty much this whole thing with the lockdown started. Now, he's basically coming off of that injury to fight Yuriorkis Gamboa. So, number one, we don't know the status of Yuriorkis Gamboa. And number two, we see what Devin Haney could do after coming off that shoulder injury. He's already been in camp. And he's already, been working out. Okay? Now, as far as like Gary Russell Jr. is concerned, no, there won't be a fight with Devin Haney for now. But look for him to fight Javier Fortuna, as Javier Fortuna is with PBC, is, there with Al Heyman, just as Gary Russell Jr. is talking with Al Heyman. And Gary Russell Jr. has said for months that he was moving up from 126 pounds. And he said his intent was to move up to 135 because there was no fight there at 130 that he would be interested in. The only one that he was interested in was fighting Tevin Farmer, but that's if Tevin Farmer beat Jojo Diaz, and he didn't. So, no 135 for Gary Russell Jr. So he's moving up to 135. And if he fights Javier Fortuna, that makes that WBC rankings look a little bit interesting if Gary Russell Jr. fights and beats Javier Fortuna, because you're going to have Devin Haney there as the WBC champion. You're going to have Gary Russell Jr. as a top-ranked contender. You're going to also have Ryan Garcia and Luke Campbell that are facing each other, or slated to face each other. We don't know. You know what Ryan Garcia said. I'm just looking for a fight date. But that's neither here nor there. We're going to see if they're going to have a fight. And if we have that fight, then you're going to have a little bit of a situation in the WBC rankings there in the lightweight division, because you have Ryan Garcia there at number 3, Luke Campbell at number 2, Javier Fortuna at number 1. And if Gary Russell Jr. fights Javier Fortuna and defeats Javier Fortuna, he would most likely take over that number 1 ranking. And then he'll say, "What's up? Y'all seen the whole thing with the term sheet? That date said May of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So, if Gary Russell Jr. does end up having that fight by December against Javier Fortuna, gets the win. You have Devin Haney against Yuriorkis Gamboa. Haney gets the win. Then we could see that fight next year. But for right now, for that November 7th date, is Devin Haney and Yuriorkis Gamboa. And that's always what it was going to be. That's it for this particular topic. You can subscribe to the Boxing Source on YouTube. You can also catch Boxing Source Radio Show live Sunday 7:30, Blog Talk Radio. It's on iTunes. It's on Google Podcasts. It's on Anchor.fm. It's on Spotify. Whatever you use for listening to podcasts, it's usually there. Check it out. But until then, I'll catch y'all later. Peace.